Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carey Nieuwhof here. And every week we try to figure out what is going on in the world and try to equip you as church leaders with how to do it. And I do this in partnership with the Barna Group. And today from Barna, we have Brooke Hempel. Brooke, welcome.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Really glad to have you and good to be together again. So we did part one of my conversation with Miles McPherson, and this week we're bringing you part two for listeners. We talked about the hybrid church. So Barna had some fascinating insights about the gap between what boomers want, which is primarily physical church, and what every other generation wanted, which was primarily a hybrid option, like give me some digital options because I'm not going to be there as often. But then Miles and I got into the whole question of racial reconciliation, which has been just, fortunately such a huge issue as we try to move things forward in the church this year. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of injustice out there. And Barna has done some major studies over the years, not just in 2020, but over the years on racial reconciliation. And I'd love for you to frame up a couple of highlights for us on that conversation, Brooke.
Yeah. So we've been working on a study that's actually coming out next year called Beyond Diversity, and it's in partnership with the Racial Justice and Unity Center, which is with Dr. Michael Emerson and Dr. Glenn Bracey. So if people know of the book Divided by Faith, it's meant to be this 20 years later follow-up to, hey, now that we've been aware of the reality of churches being very segregated and multi-ethnic churches began to really flourish, how's that going? Has that created any impact in the church? And so this research was really kind of following up on some of those questions. And you and David talked about this recently when you spoke with Latasha Morrison. We did a survey this summer, just getting a temperature check on where people's attitudes were. But it's based on the research we've been working on for over a year that will come out next year, really deep diving into what's behind some of these beliefs and perspectives and motivations. So a couple of things I wanted to highlight today, dig back to that study that was done in 2019, but allows us to take it a little bit deeper. So we talked, or David talked before about the question, do people even believe that we have a history of oppression to minorities in this country? Right. And we saw a difference for sure. And I'll focus most of this on the distinction between white practicing Christians and Black practicing Christians. We, of course, investigated the perspectives of Latino and Asian Christians as well. They're just, they're kind of in the middle. So I'm going to be looking at more of the polar opposites here. So we did see a huge gap in the acknowledgement of that history, where we've got 75% of Black practicing Christians saying that, yes, historically, the U.S. has been oppressive to minorities, and only 42% of white practicing Christians saying that. And remember, when we say practicing Christians, we're talking about people who last year were very regular churchgoers and they consider their faith really important in their lives. So these are your most engaged Christians. And there's this huge gap in their even just understanding of the history of our country.
Wow. And so that would be church-going white adults. The majority would say, no, we don't really have any historic issues of discrimination or systemic bias or any of that.
Right, exactly. Wow. And so one of the things that we've dug into in this study is exactly what you just hinted at, this idea of systemic, right? Is this an individual one-off thing, or is there like
right, like I'm not prejudiced, but maybe our culture is, or the institutions are. So you started to drill down on that.
Exactly. And so we asked a question, we were kind of forcing a trade-off. Which do you think is the bigger problem? Is it individuals' beliefs and prejudices that cause them to treat people poorly? Or is it discrimination that's built into our society and our institutions and our laws? And that's where we again saw a big difference. So 61% of white practicing Christians said it's individual issues. It's just people on their own. 66% of Black practicing Christians say, no, this is systemic. This is in our society and our institutions. And that's why we're not fixing this problem, because we're solving two different problems.
That's interesting, Brooke, because I would say this year, if you think back to the early summer when this was front page news everywhere, everyone said, I want to listen, I want to learn. And if there's one thing that I would say, there's a bunch of stuff I've learned this year, but I probably more clearly than ever realize, oh no, there really is some form of institutional um, play in here. And, as a white male who went to law school and seminary, et cetera, I realized that, yeah, the doors opened a little bit more easily for me, perhaps, than others. And to some, that would be like, no, they didn't. And others would be, well, of course, Nieuwhof, why didn't you see that 20 years ago? But I think from my own perspective, that's one of the things just in the dialogue we've had on this show, on my show, and then with a lot of friends, I'm like, oh, I think I see that not perfectly, but I think a lot more clearly than I did before. So hopefully that continues as we realize, no, it's not the same for everybody. Okay. Anything else you want to share?
So, well, we took that a little bit further and we said, so how do you bridge that gap, right? And I know you and Miles will probably talk about this in terms of what are some of the ways to address that if you are a white practicing Christian and you're suddenly realizing, oh, we've not been addressing this. And so having these interpersonal relationships is a start for sure. But one of the things that we saw in the research, which included both a lot of survey research, but also focus groups at churches that were both multiracial churches and then some that were more homogenous churches, we definitely heard over and over and over again that it needs to be a both and. So that idea of individual and systemic, we have to acknowledge both and we have to address both. So let's talk about, our individual relationship. Let's build relationship. But in doing that, we become educated about the broader issues. And then we want to kind of ride alongside and stand up for those areas where justice is not being done and be active and engaging in, changing those ways in those systems in our communities, right? So it's that both and concept that I think is really important that actually comes through discovery of getting to know someone really deeply.
Anything else you want to share? And then tell us where we can find the research. Or I know it's a 2021 report, but some of the stuff that Barna has done in this area.
That's a great point. There's so much to dive into. So I would say looking forward to that publication of this Beyond Diversity study that will come out next spring, probably February. And we have been publishing ongoing some stats that we've been tracking and ways that we've been looking at this whole issue of racial justice through the church in Barna Access. And so we have a whole channel on the race in the church where we've been publishing that data, and we'll continue to unpack some of what we're learning through the Beyond Diversity study.
Okay. Well, and, I think on the light of this has been such a polarizing issue, and the data would show that. I'm really excited to bring you part 2 of my conversation with Miles McPherson, where he says maybe it doesn't have to be as polarizing as you think. So Miles joined us last time. He is a former NFL player. He is the pastor of the Rock Church in San Diego, and also the author of The Third Option. So here is my conversation, part 2, with Miles McPherson. You said something interesting, and I want to make sure I caught it accurately, but you said that whenever you talk to people about diversity, you get a political answer. Andy Stanley was on this podcast, and he said about the whole reopening for physical gathering when he called the opponents who were upset about North Point not opening until 2021 for physical attendance. He found that 100% it was political answers. Can you describe what you mean by political answer to racial justice or diversity?
100%. So you hear what people are saying as one excuses to not be engaged they get from one news station, or excuses and reasons for certain behavior from another news station. And excuses, well, those people are this, and the stats say this, and they had a chance. And so the answers aren't, I need to love people and fight for justice because the Bible says so. And I need to go out of my way and be uncomfortable, be willing to be uncomfortable for my brother because the Bible says so. I need to love people who don't agree. So I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said, look, if an alligator and a bear had a fight, who would win? Have you heard this?
No, I haven't.
So just think about it. If an alligator and a bear had a fight, who would win? The answer is, depends on where they fight. If they fight in the water, the alligator wins. If they fight in the land, the bear wins. And fighting in the water is us versus them. That's the political fight. I have a better argument than you, and I'm going to prove you wrong so you can believe what I believe or do things the way I do things. And that's the culture. Fox and CNN or
yeah. Can you give us an example of what a political approach to racism would be, or toward racial justice would be? Like, just a typical answer, either from the left or from the right.
Our political answer is, let's say someone says systemic racism or white privilege, right?
Right.
Now, a lot of people don't know what those terms mean, and they'll say there's no such thing. Everybody has an equal chance. Well, the people who say that usually aren't Black, usually, and they may not even know Black people, but they heard that somewhere. Someone told them that because that's a good excuse. Or people saying, I don't see color. I don't see color and I'm not racist. And that, one, it's not true. Of course we all see color. Even if you're colorblind, you see gray and black and white. But it's a political answer, or it's a socially, I shouldn't even say socially. It's an answer that protects me from getting engaged in the conversation. And in other words, if I don't see your color, that means I don't have to engage in your pain. I don't have to engage in your perspective that may out me as being offensive or ignorant or blind. People saying I'm not racist, therefore I can't be, therefore everything I say is okay. You can be racially offensive and not be racist. And so those kind of lines or one-liners are kind of protective walls of people that protect people in their mind from engaging in the conversation and understanding what the other perspective is. Because if I tell you I've been offended, right, and you say, well, I'm not a racist, that's your way of saying it doesn't matter to me. I just don't want to get involved. When as a believer, if I offend you, it's like, look, I want to know how, so I can, apologize, not do it again. But I don't want to be so defensive that I deny my responsibility to love you and understand. And by the way, I would love to explain white privilege and systemic racism so people understand what I mean.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this world was made by right hand. Let me back up. In our culture, we have us versus them, and those are the two options the world gives you, and you feel like you have to be on one side or the other. And it's basically a Republican perspective and a Democratic perspective. And if I'm on one side, I have to agree with all the rhetoric of that side. And if I agree with the other side, then I am a sellout. So if I say, if someone says the words Black Lives Matter, they are put in a box. And so if you say those words, you're put in a category and you have all these characteristics attributed to you. And then you have to believe this against the police. You have to believe this against. And so those are the political things versus saying, does that even resonate? Do Black Lives Matter just as a statement? But people feel like if I even agree with that statement, it's like saying, do women matter? Can I at least say that just as a statement? Forget the organization, forget all political trappings. But that's the problem, is that all that comes with it. And so we live in this us versus them culture. The third, and by the way, us versus them doesn't work. As long as you play that game, you're going to lose. So that's the alligator. The bear, the third option is where the bear fights, and is that we honor what we have in common. And so if we can say we are all more similar than different, which is the third option, that you and I, you may be from Canada, I'm from the US in New York, you're white, I'm Black. We both wear glasses.
Yeah.
How old are you, by the way?
I'm 55.
So you're 55, I'm 60, right? So we are simply, even though we have a lot of things that aren't exactly the same, we are simply variations of the same thing.
Yes.
You have a different color than me. You have a different state than me. You have a different country than me. But we still have countries, color, and states and families. And so if we can focus on the fact that we're more similar, that's the third option. When it comes to privilege and systemic racism, all of us are in different groups, and guys are a group, women are a group, people of color, people of different colors are a group, different shades of brown, I should say. And whenever you identify your group, you understand that group. You understand Canadians better than me, because that's Canadians are a group, Americans a group. And once we identify the group, we give in-group bias. You are more comfortable with Canadians. you will be less comfortable with black people from New York. That's not your group. It doesn't necessarily mean you are racist, but that's not your group. It's foreign to you.
Yeah, I don't understand the culture, the subculture as much, and you wouldn't understand the Central Ontario culture I know fairly well.
Exactly.
100%. Yeah.
100%. Doesn't mean you hate them. And you may even avoid it because you're uncomfortable. It doesn't mean that necessarily that you're biased against them in the sense that see them as inferior.
Correct.
And so in whatever culture, whoever's the predominant culture, anywhere in the world, they write the rules. Mm-hmm. And racism is when you see someone as less than you because of their color, their tribe. In Africa, it's tribal. It's black on black, but it's tribal. In India, it's a caste system. If you're in a different caste, you're less than me. So whoever's in charge writes the rules. And one easy way of seeing that is all over the world. If you're right-handed, the world was made by right-handed people by right-handed people. I'm left-handed. Mm-hmm. Your desk is on the right side. You get right-handed golf clubs. Your right-handed catcher's mitt, and you shake with your right hand. And so right-handed people don't realize the advantage they have of being right-handed. They never had to think about it. Everything is made for them. Now, if you're left-handed, you notice if someone says, hey, you're going to go buy this driver for golf. Well, you better call ahead before you go to the golf shop because they might not have it, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you're right-handed, you have an advantage over left-handed people because the right-handed culture created the culture for right-handed people, not necessarily maliciously against left-handed people. It's the only thing they knew. And so it's called right privilege. And so that's the privilege, is that people who see the world the way you do created the rules from their perspective. And by the way, in some very malicious, obviously slavery was very malicious, and a lot of Jim Crow laws and et cetera, were very intentionally malicious. But even taking that out of it, when you only have a perspective of how you live, I was talking to a pastor today, and literally they're going through my book, this church it's all white church. They have 150 people, and they have about a group of 40 going through the book. And he literally said to me today, most of the people in my group don't know any black people.
Yeah. Well, that was honest.
I was sitting there going, and they're right here in San Diego. He said, they don't know anybody. So if you don't know any people, how do you know about them? How do you know that you're not uncomfortable with them? How do you know what they could even feel? How can you even imagine other than you got it from television, from the news, okay? And so the privilege for those people is that even what he told me today is that when they were reading through the book, they had the opportunity, the advantage to say, I don't want to talk about racism today, and walk away. I don't want to have to deal with it and walk away. That's an advantage or a privilege. Mm-hmm. You can actually avoid it and not have to deal with it. That's a privilege. Now, does it mean that you have more money than everybody else? No. Does it mean that you're necessarily racist? No, not necessarily, but it means that you have an advantage that other people don't. That's all it means. And now people get defensive because they think that, and sometimes it is used this way, that everything's easy for you. Now it may be easier. You may have more connections. You can, most of the time when you go places, you see people who look like you. Imagine being the only one that looked like you ever, much less every day. Those are the advantages that you have. And when you're around people who are like you, you get in-group bias, which is just, even if it's just a hello when you wouldn't get a hello, and you're used to that, and you're used to seeing people like you in charge, you're used to seeing people like you with a boss, there's an advantage to that that's inherent just from being it. Now, the systemic part is that's systemic. Everywhere you go, that's how it is. So everywhere I go, usually I'm the minority. One of the things I wrote about in my book is I asked 5 white people to go a place where they were the only white person. Just go someplace. I'm not talking about going to Africa. Go someplace in your neighborhood where you're the only white person and just answer these questions. And then you can get an idea what it feels like to be the other. And it's going to feel uncomfortable and you're going to want to go back. Well, imagine living that every day.
Yeah.
So that's the advantage. It doesn't mean that, you're rich necessarily, or you're evil. It just means that you have an advantage. You live in a culture that was created by people like you, for people like you.
It's funny, because about 3 or 4 years ago, I was speaking at a conference and a bunch of us went out for dinner. You know how that goes, the speakers. And I'm sitting there and I have a couple of African-American friends who are sitting around the table and we're just meeting. I don't know, it was in Dallas or something like that. We're having dinner and the subject of racial justice came up. And so we're just chatting and he goes, well, you see it, right? I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, look around this restaurant. We are the only 2 Black people here. I didn't see it until he pointed it out. I look around the restaurant. I'm like, you're 100% right. Like I didn't, and is that an example of like stuff that we just don't see as Caucasian people?
100%. You don't have to think about it. Now,
no, I didn't. And
think
really, I'll never forget that. And I'm like, okay, I'm seeing things differently now.
But I will tell you this. If it was all Black in that restaurant, you would have noticed that.
I would have noticed. You're right. You're right. Yeah.
I know I'm not going to pin you on this, but you probably would have went to another restaurant, right? So that's the reality of what does that feel like? There's a guy who is I think he was on The Bachelor, Nick Vile, and he interviewed me and we were talking about this. And he said he was in line to get on a plane. And he was in group 9, which I didn't know it had a group 9, but he was in group 9.
That's like you're at the back at that point.
In the back.
Yeah.
So there was an African-American lady in front of him in group 9. And she had a broken arm. She had arm in a cast. And she comes up and they had called group 1 or 2 or something. There wasn't group 9. I know that. So she goes up and the lady, the flight attendant says, no, you're in group 9. You have to wait. He walks up right after her and he's in group 9. And she says, oh, go ahead on. Now he was thinking about this stuff because we had read the book, but he realized, what was that? Now, am I saying that happens all the time? I can't speak for all the time, but it happens often, and so it's something that if you don't experience it, you think people are making it up, and therefore that's why when you talked about political responses, these are canned responses that are not based on fact. You know, people make it up. That stuff doesn't really happen. Instead of saying, as a believer in Christ, I want to love people. It's like if a woman told me, or a woman on my staff said, you know, if they said it to me, you are biased against women. It would be so arrogant for me to say, no, I'm not. Versus saying, now I don't want to be, and I've never had that said to me. However, if someone said that to me, I should say, tell me how. I want to know so I don't do it again. And when you hear people give canned reasons why they're not, without even really getting the evidence from somebody, it's like if you say I'm not racist. Well, how do you know? You know, if you're not racist, how do you really know? Who told you that? You know, and so I don't want to do that to women or anybody. I want to know if I have a blind spot.
No, that's a really helpful, nuanced, thoughtful response. Again, with a little bit, 2020 has been a year, and we've called it the crisis within a crisis: racial justice, racial reconciliation, and the issue has been elevated at different points over the last 12 months. In what way have the recent events changed the conversation, or perhaps you think, no, it hasn't changed the conversation at all? Like looking back on the last year, how has that impacted the dialogue and the cause?
It has been, I've seen more and more churches and people wanting to talk about it. It's been like a roller coaster. So over the last 4 or 5 years, I've seen more and more people wanting to talk about it. And then George Floyd happened. And George Floyd it changed all of us. I think anybody with a soul, it has changed in some way, and especially for that first 30 days. And then after all the protests and then some of the riots happened, people said, well, I'm out. You know, I don't want to.
Yeah.
But I think more people are saying, no, we got to deal with this because they learned things. They started seeing things from different lenses. And I know for me, it's changed my life. I've actually had some African-American friends say the same thing that I experienced, that I had something triggered in me when that happened that took me back to when I was a kid, that I realized that I have felt and sensed this sense of powerlessness to the white culture since I was little. And it triggered on me when I saw that cop killed George Floyd, that I never put it in those words. And I had another friend, same thing. He had something triggered in him. So I think that the now that the dust kind of has settled from the I don't know how many weeks of protest.
I get what you mean.
That people are going, okay, we have to deal with this and really think about how our brothers and sisters, what their experience really is, and come together. I'm hopeful that it's going to result in people learning. I wrote this curriculum for schools and churches and businesses based on the third option, a 6-week curriculum that I'm seeing a lot of interest in, because people, and it's all based on how do we love one another, how we honor what we have in common. And I've had people who are not Christian in tears saying, I never knew. And I had a firefighter on the East Coast watched this presentation, the secular version, and he was in tears telling his chief, I was always told this and I was wrong and I need to apologize. And he was crying. I think people are made in the image of God. They're made to respond to love. They're made to respond to God's word, and they're created to love. And once we have our eyes open of how we haven't done that and how we can, people respond. I've seen so many people who are not believers respond to the book and the content, the concept of honoring what we have in common.
One of the really surprising things, it's been a really rich conversation, but we do a lot of polling, especially in 2020. We have the ability at Barna. Barna has the ability to track more in real time. So one of the stats that came out in the fall of 2020, and I want to get this right, I've got the data here. We asked the question, Barna asked the question, how motivated are you to address racial justice in our society? And there was actually a backtrack, a demotivation to adjust it. So white self-identified Christians in 2019 said 67% were very or somewhat motivated. In 2020, that went from 67% to 54%.
Just white evangelicals? Yeah, I can tell you why.
Tell me why. Yeah, what do you think?
And when was that taken?
That was taken in the fall of 2020, I believe.
Yeah.
August or September of 2020.
Yeah. Well, this is my theory. I can't speak for those people, but my theory is that it's uncomfortable to begin with because white people aren't accustomed to speaking, and usually they are lumped in with the cause because in this country, whites have dominated, so they get lumped in with being the perpetrator of it. And that's uncomfortable. So why do I want to deal with that? Now, I'm not justifying it because we should deal with it, and it's unfortunate. But the other side too is that it's unfortunate that blacks we don't have a choice but to deal with it. So that's the other way of seeing it. But I think the reason people are backing away is because of the incidences after George Floyd. Now it's come even more hostile. And so now I think that's very unfortunate. I think it's very sad. But I do know, and I do know this, that there are a lot of people who are whites who are way more motivated to deal with it. And once they get people that they have a relationship with and they start having a meaningful conversation, they see it as very, very fruitful and very beneficial.
What would your advice be to white leaders who are worried about having the conversation, fearful about having the conversation, or just like, yeah, I hear what you're saying, I don't disagree with you, but I don't know whether I really want to bring it up? What would you say to them?
Yeah. You know, I would say, I gotta be careful what I say because I don't want to. First, I would say, several things. One, and let me say the nice thing first.
Yeah.
Oh man. I'd probably ask them, do you have any black friends? And do you have any black people you care about? And if you don't, then there lies a problem. And if you do, what you're saying is that you really don't care about them. You're just caring about being comfortable. Because we don't have a choice. And someone asked me recently on an interview, what was one of the most offensive things that have happened recently? And I said, being told that it's not real. And so I would say that. I would say, how pitiful that you don't want to be uncomfortable. How sad that you don't want to be uncomfortable. Number two or three. Listen, get a. If there's one thing about Black people and minorities, I would say, is that we have put up with stuff forever to this, up until this conversation still, right? Yeah. And it's like, there's an incredible amount of patience. And I would say, if you sat down with an African-American friend, a Latino friend, a Latino that have freshly immigrated to this country, and say, I want to learn, I guarantee you will walk away from that conversation thinking, man, how grace-filled was that conversation? How much I learned, and how pitiful as I was just wanting to stay in my comfortable bubble and let them deal with their issue and call myself a pastor. How are you ministering to your people? I would tell you, if you have people of color in your church, and that's you don't have a diverse ministry. You have a diverse congregation, but you're not ministering to them. And I'm not saying the word is not speaking to them, but for real, do you really care? How could you really care about people who are marginalized right in front of you and say, I don't want to get involved? That's not a pastor.
That's a really good word. Any advice to African-American leaders who are listening? What would you say to them in this moment?
I was talking to an African-American leader, and it came up, why do we always have to keep re-educating, and be impatient? And I would say, if they're a pastor, I would say, let's just continue to fight the good fight and love on people. I do think a lot of people, whites, are wanting to come around, and I would encourage you to keep being aggressive and in trying to engage them in the conversation. I know a lot of whites that I know are being engaged, and some are running. And I would say, let's keep pressing it. And I also would say this: God's going to honor you if for your patience. Let's continue to honor God. Let's continue to honor God. Now, not a lot of people are not patient anymore. George Floyd was the end of it. I mean, that was hard. And I get that. I don't get anything. I don't condone violence or anything, but I get the lack of the patience running out. But if we're as leaders, that we can lead and be an example to our people, to be very persistent, but very loving, but very persistent. And listen, I have an integrated church. I didn't have to write a book on racism. I did 2 years ago, and I don't have to be doing it now. And God said, no, you go. And I said, all right, let's go, God. I'm gonna step in it, and be very persistent with it. And it's probably going to be, what I spend a lot of my future doing. But I'm seeing a lot of people respond to love, but love that confronts the issue in a loving way. So I would say, just keep being faithful. God's going to honor you.
It's been a rich conversation. Any final thoughts as we wrap up today?
Yeah, I would encourage people to not only get the book, The Third Option, but there's an e-course, Christian and secular. It's the Third Option training. You can go to milesmcpherson.com, and it's called Similarity Training. And we're going to put this in schools, and we already have it in churches and Christian organizations, but corporations. I did a training for the DA's office, 1,000 staff for the DA's office. And just take the Bible out, and it's still biblical, right? Love people, honor what we have in common, honor our humanity. And I would encourage people to get that and walk through it. And I would get back to your white leaders. Listen, I guess you do have a choice culturally, but you don't have a choice biblically. And I would choose God to say, Lord, I'm going to engage. And the easiest thing to do is just get a friend. Go have coffee. Just have a conversation. My goodness. And he ain't going to bite your head off. He or she's going to be so blessed that you had the courage to have a conversation. And you're going to like, why did I wait so long? The devil's just the one tricking you to not do that.
Miles, can't thank you enough for being with us today on Church Pulse Weekly. Thank you.
Hey, my pleasure, man.
Well, that was the second part of my conversation with Miles McPherson. Hey, there's so much data, and I find for myself that trying to fly by instruments, by dashboard, rather than just by sight is really good. And if you're really trying to lead your church, and maybe there's some division and you haven't found the third option yet, and you want to figure out, well, what do people actually think about this? And what do leaders think about this? And what are others doing? You can find a lot more by simply going to barna.com/race and the church. So the 2021 study will not be available, obviously, until it's released, but there's an awful lot of data there, historic and current, at barna.com/race and the church. So you can also go to barnaaccess.com. That's your gateway to everything, and you'll find it there. We're back next time with a fresh episode on Church Pulse Weekly. If this episode meant something to you, please share it on social. Let us know. We love to hear how this is impacting you. I'm so glad to be in this together with you, and I hope our time together today has really helped you. We'll see you next time on